Last year, I took a bunch of tomato seedlings, cut them in half, and spliced them onto a bunch of other tomato seedlings. That process is called tomato grafting, and I did it because it is purported to have a host of benefits, things I really needed to improve in my own tomato gardening. So today, let's look back at that grafted tomato garden and whether or not they lived up to the hype, or if we should put our efforts into other strategies. Let's do it. So the first criteria that I was really interested in was, would their roots simply be bigger and stronger and tougher and do a better job of penetrating my really terrible clay soil? And I think the answer to that was like a resounding yes. The root systems on the grafted plants were honestly, they were frankly ridiculous. Let me go show you one that I didn't fully pull out of the ground. Again, these died late fall last year, and the root systems are still in the ground just because I cut them off level with the soil. You can see here, like, they kind of resemble more like a young perennial tree. Their roots were just unreal. So if you have tough soil, that is definitely something to keep in mind, because in my limited experience here, these grafted plants really do produce a bigger, stronger, tougher root system. So, if that's something you're looking for, which probably all of us are. I was also curious if I could select a variety of rootstock tomatoes that would handle temperature fluctuations more gracefully. More specifically, what I mean by that is we really struggle to set fruit during the hottest times of summer because tomato pollen simply goes bad at really high temperatures. And that's pretty common with a lot of plants. It's very common with nightshades in particular. And it's definitely true where I live, where we start getting into those triple digits many days out of the week. You just don't get a lot of new fruit set. And I was hoping the grafted tomatoes would help with that. And unfortunately, y'all, I didn't see any evidence that they did. The plants themselves actually looked really healthy. It was as if the plants and the plant tissue withstood those temperature fluctuations better than the normal tomatoes, but in terms of fruit set, which is what I really care about, they didn't. So if you deal with a lot of temperature fluctuations harming the actual health of the vegetation of your plants, maybe something to look into. But as far as I could tell, it didn't actually improve the productivity of our plants. It didn't help the fruit set, which is, what I cared about. One of the questions I got a lot when I made that original video about grafted tomatoes was around whether or not they were going to do a better job of withstanding disease pressure. And to be honest, when I went into it, I didn't really think our grafted tomatoes would do a better job of handling diseases, because most of our diseases, as far as I know, are really spread by flying insects. A lot of them seem to come from the white flies that we get a couple of times throughout the year. And it just didn't really make sense to me that grafted tomatoes, most of which live under the ground in the soil, were going to help with diseases that are spread by flying insects. But they kind of seem to do just that. Surprisingly, I don't know if it was just because they were healthier plants with those giant root systems, but overall they did seem to go all the way into late fall without dealing with a lot of disease pressure. And even when it seemed like there was disease pressure, some of those leaves got a little bit funky, it didn't slow down the plant. So, if tomato plant diseases are one of your primary concerns, that's one of the things that you really struggle with, maybe this is a really good avenue for you to look into. Easily the biggest surprise I had on the positive front to the upside of grafted tomatoes was how much impact they had on some of our more vulnerable, fragile heirloom tomatoes, specifically my San Marzano and yellow pear cherry tomatoes really, really benefited from being on that grafted rootstock much more than any of the hybrid tomatoes that we grew. And last year we did grow primarily hybrid tomatoes. And really, the plants that seemed to benefit the most were those heirlooms, right? So the takeaway there, I think, is if you know there are certain varieties of heirloom tomatoes that just taste amazing to you, that you love to eat, but that don't seem to do well in your climate. A great example for me is Paul Robeson tomatoes. I think they're the most delicious thing on earth. They're so, 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 so delicious, and they grow so, so, so poorly in my garden. If you have a tomato variety like that, an heirloom variety, maybe consider doing a few of them on grafted rootstock. In my experience, those were the plants that really, really benefited from all that extra work. The second upside I noticed, and that I was very, very surprised by, was that my grafted tomato plants really lasted longer into the season, like to a comical degree. I was really surprised by this. The grafted tomatoes lived through 2 gentle frost. I'm not gonna say that they're gonna live through some deep freezes, y'all. That's unrealistic for tomato plants, but they actually did live through 2 light frost in sort of mid-fall for us. If you live somewhere with short growing seasons, or you live somewhere with unpredictable first frosts, where you have to worry about when that first freeze is gonna come in, I would really recommend that you experiment with grafted tomatoes. I ended up taking out our grafted tomatoes weeks after the other ones. Now, they weren't super productive at that time, to be 100% honest. They weren't producing a lot of new fruit, but the plants themselves were healthy, and the fruit that had already set did seem to be ripening on the vine. So if you need those extra couple weeks, something to look into. Now, the big surprise to the downside I had was something that I've never heard anyone else talk about with grafted tomatoes. One of our sun gold cherry tomatoes, just one, and we grew probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 last year, was absolutely horrifically disgusting. The fruit it produced were inedible. At first, I actually thought I had done something wrong, and the fruit it was producing was actually from the grafted tomato, as in I was eating the fruit from that grafted tomato, which you shouldn't do. But as I looked at the graft, it was clear that wasn't what was happening, and it did seem to be producing sun gold tomatoes, which was the scion, right? The tomato plant on the top there. It's just, it was producing like mutant sun gold tomatoes. They were hard and kind of dry and completely flavorless. Only happened to one of the plants out of all of the grafted tomatoes that we grew, but it was very strange. I don't know why it happened, but I thought I should at least report it because, well, it was a pretty big downside. We lost out on the production from one plant in our garden. And if you have a small tomato garden, that could be a major problem. The biggest question we had was ultimately, would they produce more tomatoes? Were they going to be more productive? You know, at any given time, would I be able to go out to a row of grafted tomatoes and harvest more of them than I would from our other rows of tomatoes? And I didn't weigh our harvest. And that's really what I should have done, right? If I was designing a real experiment, I should have had controls. I should have been carefully weighing our tomatoes, carefully weighing our harvest, and I didn't do that. So all I can do is provide you sort of my honest evaluation, my honest anecdotes as a homestead gardener, a home gardener who is trying to eat lots of tomatoes. Didn't really seem like they did produce more tomatoes, to be honest. It seemed very, very equivalent. And I was very surprised by that because by the middle of the season, those plants were monsters. Their roots, as I mentioned, were monsters. They seemed incredibly healthy, but it just didn't seem to translate into production. And I don't know if that's simply because our other tomatoes were pretty healthy and there just wasn't any more juice to squeeze, as it were, or if that's just maybe a reflection on the value of grafted tomatoes. Maybe I just was unrealistic assuming they were going to produce more food for us. But yeah, I just didn't perceive any real difference in their production. And that was a pretty big bummer. Actually, I want to add on to that. I made notes throughout the season here about how the grafted tomatoes were doing. And I'm looking at a note from pretty much the middle of summer, just wrote down, were they more productive? Are they being more productive tomato plants? And to quote here, it says, somehow they are a little less productive. My grafted tomato plants seem to be a little less productive. They're producing less fruit. They're huge plants, but they are putting off less fruit. That's direct from my notes. So yeah, really, really sort of disappointing on that front. So, $1 million question, right? Would I do it again? Am I doing it again? Are any of these tomatoes that I am currently growing and that I am working so hard to make healthy? Wow, look at the roots on this. Sorry, I always get distracted. Are any of these grafted this year? The answer is no. And it's kind of a resounding no. Even though there were some real positives, and I mentioned all of those, I think. I went through all of those positives. Even though there were some real upsides, the thing that I cared the most about was did the grafted tomatoes produce more fruit, and was it really delicious, equally delicious? And the answer was just no. Thanks for sticking around. I hope this was interesting. I hope it doesn't turn you off of grafting if it is something that you were interested in trying. I had a lot of fun doing it. It made me feel like a kind of weird botanical Dr. Frankenstein. And so from that perspective, it was a success. After all, you know, I want gardening to be fun. I'm hoping gardening is going to be fun for you. But those were my conclusions as they were, and I want to be honest about them. Until next time, y'all, happy gardening, and I hope to see you on the next video.